In this video, we're going to learn all the bones of the human body. Now, the good news is that of the 206 bones, most of them are the same on one side as they are on the other. So if you remember that there's a humerus on this side, well, there's a humerus on this side. The other thing that's encouraging is most of the bones are going to be found in the wrist and in the feet. So the hand bones, 27 hand bones, 26 foot bones. So if you get all 27 in one hand, you're going to get 27 in the other hand. You're off to a great start, 54. Similarly with the feet, if you get 26 in one foot, 26 in the other foot, 52, you're well over 100 bones just in hands and feet. So the good news is if you get bones on one half, you're in pretty good shape to get bones on the other half. Let's start with bones in the skull, and we'll start with this bone right here in the front. What I would recommend is that during the video, you just point to the bone as I describe them with me, and that'll help you to remember what those bones are, and then the little mnemonic that goes along with each one. For the cranial bones, we have 8 cranial bones. Of those 8, 4 are individuals, 2 are pairs. In the facial bones, there's 14 of those bones. In that case, 6 are pairs and 2 are individual. So let's start here in the front with the frontal bone. So frontal bone in the front, hopefully you remember from anatomical terms and positions that's the frontal region, frontal bone. So just think frontal bone, frontal region. The bone in the back here is called the occipital bone. So think of it like occipital, ocular, has to do with eyes in the back of your head, ocular, occipital. So think frontal in the front, eyes in the back of your head, occipital. Here on the side, if you have a headache, you're going to rub the temporal bones. So if you have a headache, rub the temporal bones, and at the top of the skull is a pair of parietal bones. So think pair of parietal. So let's just review those. In the front is the frontal, eyes in the back of your head, occipital. If you have a headache, rub the temporal, and then at the top, pair of parietal bones. Now move to the facial bones. The only movable bone in the head is the mandible. So think movable mandible, this lower jawbone, movable mandible. Above it is the maxilla. So think mustache, maxilla. Now maybe you have a mustache, maybe you don't, but that's where the mustache would grow, the maxilla bone, and there's a pair. So movable, mandible, mustache, maxilla. There's a little bone right here in the corner of your eye where your lacrimal gland comes out. That's how you cry. So think if you're crying, it's the lacrimal bone, this little tiny bone with a hole in it, a foramen in it, that is the duct for the tear duct. So lacrimal if you're crying. And then this bone here, the zygomatic bone, if you're smiling, that's going to be the muscles attached that allow you to smile. So think crying, lacrimal, smiling, zygomatic. So let's review. In the front is the frontal, eyes in the back of your head, occipital. If you have a headache, you rub the temporal. At the top are a pair of parietal. Movable, mandible, mustache, maxilla. If you're crying, it's the lacrimal. And if you're smiling, it's the zygomatic bone. Front here of your nose, you have a pair of bones, your nasal bones. So think nose and nasal, like a nasal spray. So think nose, nasal bone. And then you have a few bones that are facial bones, but they're hard to find. For example, your sphenoid bone, it looks like this ghost. It looks like a specter. So I think of specter, sphenoid, and it's tucked here. You can kind of see the wings of it under the zygomatic bone. It goes across the inside. It's deep inside of the skull, and it looks kind of like this. So think sphenoid. A little more anterior is another kind of hidden bone right here in the front of the head. It's called the ethmoid bone. So I think enclosed ethmoid, because again, it's hard to see. Like there's not much of it that protrudes to the external skeleton. It's deep, so ethmoid enclosed. Think of that, ethmoid enclosed. And then dividing your nose into 2 kind of parts, right and left, is the vomer. Vomer just means plow, and it's this big bone that runs down the middle of your nose that looks like this, and it splits your nose in half. Vomer, plow. And on either side of your nose are the inferior nasal conchae, which are just, conchae just means shell. So think inferior, low, nasal, because it's where you would pick your nose, shell. So think shell where I would pick my nose. So that's inferior nasal conchae. And then the last bone, that's the facial bone, is the palatine bone. So the palatine bones are where if you take your tongue and you put it right behind your front teeth, that's the hard palate. Those are going to be the bones that make up the roof of your mouth. So think palate, like I want to cleanse my palate, palatine bones. So let's review those. Right here in the front is the frontal, eyes in the back of your head, occipital. If you have a headache, you rub the temporal, and at the top are a pair of parietal. The movable mandible, mustache, maxilla. If you're crying, it's the lacrimal. If you're smiling, it's the zygomatic. Then you have the nasal bone. Then deep in your skull is going to be the sphenoid bone, it looks like a specter, the ethmoid bone, which is enclosed, and the inferior nasal concha, the bone that you would pick, and your palatine bones are at the roof of your mouth. Moving down the skeleton, we'll get to this bone that is not attached. It's not attached to the rest of the skeleton. It's the hyoid bone. So think of it like it just sticks out here in your throat, and you're going to say hi to the hyoid bone. So say hi to the hyoid. That's right there. In your neck, these vertebrae are called cervical vertebrae. So C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, C6, C7 are cervical vertebrae, they're in your neck, so think about your cervical region, cervical vertebrae in your neck. These vertebrae here make up your trunk, so thoracic vertebrae, trunk. So think cervical, neck, thoracic, trunk. And then lumbar for lower back. So cervical in your neck, thoracic, trunk, lumbar, lower back. Then in your pelvis area, you've got two. One is the sacrum. So think I sit on my sacrum, and then the coccyx, this tailbone, that's a shock absorber. So think coccyx, tailbone. So let's incorporate those. Here in the front, we have the frontal, eyes in the back of your head, occipital. If you have a headache, you rub the temporal. At the top are a pair of parietal. Movable mandible, mustache, maxilla. If you're crying, it's the lacrimal. If you're smiling, it's the zygomatic. The nasal bones make up your nose. Deep inside is the specter, that's the sphenoid. The enclosed bone is the ethmoid. Dividing your nose is the vomer. Then if you're picking your nose, it's the inferior nasal concha. And then your palate is your palatine bone. Say hi to the hyoid. You have the cervical. The trunk is thoracic. Lower back, lumbar. You sit on the sacrum. Your coccyx is a shock absorber. To remember the number of vertebrae, think of it like meals, breakfast, lunch, dinner. Breakfast at 7, there's 7 cervical vertebrae. Lunch at 12, there's 12 thoracic vertebrae. And then dinner at 5, there's 5 lumbar vertebrae. And then the sacrum, those bones are fused. There's 5 bones that are fused there. And then the coccyx, again, those bones are fused. So let's look now at the bones of the rib cage, and then bones of the pectoral girdle. So I think of it like this. This bone here, the clavicle, is the most commonly broken bone. So the clavicle, most commonly broken. We sometimes call it the collarbone. So collarbone, clavicle, most commonly broken bone. This bone back here, the spatula. So think flat like a spatula, the scapula. So think scapula, this bone here is the scapula, flat like a spatula, the scapula. And then this bone here, the sternum, think about a stern person poking you in the sternum. So think stern person pokes you in the sternum. Let's incorporate those bones then into our sequence. Right here in the front is the frontal, eyes in the back of your head, occipital. If you have a headache, you're going to rub the temporal. At the top is a pair of parietals. The movable mandible, mustache, maxilla. If you're crying, it's the lacrimal. If you're smiling, it's the zygomatic. The nasal bones are here on your nose. Behind that deep is the sphenoid, like a specter. The enclosed bone is the ethmoid bone. Dividing your nose is the vomer. Picking your nose is the inferior nasal concha. The palate is your palatine bone. Say hi to the hyoid, cervical, thoracic, lumbar. So neck, trunk, lower back. You sit on your sacrum. Your coccyx is a shock absorber. A commonly broken bone is your clavicle, flat like a spatula, your scapula. A stern person pokes you in the sternum. For your ribs, these ribs that attach from the vertebrae directly to the sternum are called true ribs. So these are true ribs. These ribs kind of connect to each other first, and then they connect to the sternum. So these are false ribs. So true, false, and these ribs here aren't connected to anything. They're called floating ribs. So true, false, floating ribs. All right, so we'll add those into our sequence. Right here in the front is the frontal. Here in the back is the occipital, eyes in the back of the head. If you have a headache, you rub the temporal at the top or a pair of parietals. The movable mandible, mustache, maxilla. If you're crying, it's the lacrimal. If you're smiling, it's the zygomatic bone. Movable mandible, mustache, maxilla. Deep in the skull is the sphenoid. The enclosed bone is the ethmoid. Right here is the nasal bone, right on your nose. Dividing the bone is dividing the nose is the vomer. Picking your nose is the inferior nasal concha. Say hi to the hyoid, cervical, that's the neck, thoracic, trunk, lower back, lumbar. You sit on the sacrum, and the shock absorber is the coccyx. A very commonly broken bone, clavicle. Flat like a spatula, scapula. A stern person pokes you in the sternum. These ribs are true, these ribs are false, these ribs are floating. The arm, so we'll just kind of work our way down the arm. Your upper arm bone here is the humerus. It's the bone that you bang and you're like, ah, my funny bone, but it's not so funny. Well, to everybody else it's funny, to you it's like, ow, it's painful. So it's your not so funny bone, your humerus, your not so funny bone, humerus. The bone here with it looks like it has a wheel on the top of it, that's the radius. Think of it like rotating and radius, rotating radius. And then on the pinky side is the ulna. So think of ulna, pinky, U-P. So you can think of it like UP, like up, or you can think of it like UP, IP, we all P. Either way, ulna, pinky, rotating radius. The carpals, so think of it like you're driving a car with your carpals, driving a car with your wrist bones are your carpal bones. Your fist bones are your metacarpal bones, the bones that you would use to make a fist. So these knuckles right here are all metacarpal bones, and then you have phalanges. The way your metacarpal bones work is starting at the thumb is number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the thumb is metacarpal 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's pretty easy to remember. And for your phalanges are named like this. There's 3 bones in most of your phalanges, your finger bones, except your thumb has 2 bones. But it goes proximal, so think back to your anatomical terms. Proximal means close, distal means far. So proximal, intermediate, distal, or proximal, middle, distal, different textbooks, different ways of describing it, but it's still proximal, distal, and then middle or intermediate phalanges. So, and the phalanges are the same way as your metacarpals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that helps you to remember those.
To remember the wrist bones, think of this acronym. So long to pinky, here comes the thumb. Scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, perciform, hamate, capitate, trapezoid, trapezium.
All right, now let's incorporate those arm bones into our skeleton. Here in the front is the frontal, eyes in the back of your head, occipital. If you have a headache, you rub the temporal at the top of the head, or a pair of parietals. Movable mandible, mustache, maxilla. If you're crying, it's the lacrimal. If you're smiling, it's the zygomatic. The nasal bone here on your nose. The hidden bone, like a specter, is the sphenoid. The enclosed bone is the ethmoid. Dividing your nose is the vomer. Picking your nose is the inferior nasal concha. The palate is your palatine bone. Say hi to the hyoid. The cervical bones, thoracic bones, lumbar, sacrum, coccyx. You sit on the sacrum. Coccyx is the shock absorber. Most commonly broken bone, clavicle, flat like a spatula, scapula. A stern person pokes you in the sternum. These ribs are true. These are false. These down here are floating. The not so funny bone is the humerus bone. The rotating radius on the pinky side is the ulna, UP. Drive your car with your wrist. Those are carpal bones. Your fist is the metacarpal bones, and your fingers are phalanges. Let's move now then to the pelvic girdle. The pelvic girdle, there's 3 bones in your pelvis. The ilium, that's this big flat bone. You can actually feel it in your hip here, the ilium here. The ischium, that's this bone back here, which makes for a bony behind. So think bony behind, ischium. The ilium is your hip bone that you can kind of feel around your waist. And then in the front is your pubis, where your pubic hair would be. So let's incorporate the bones of the pelvis. And this time we're just going to start with the hyoid. So say hi to the hyoid. The neck is cervical. The trunk, thoracic, lower back, lumbar. You sit on the sacrum, coccyx is the shock absorber. A very commonly broken bone, clavicle, flat like a spatula, scapula. A stern person pokes you in the sternum. These ribs are true. These are false. These are floating. The not so funny bone is the humerus, the rotating radius. The pinky side is the ulna. The wrist bones are carpals. The fist bones are metacarpals, and the fingers are phalanges. Here, the hip bone, that's the ilium. The bony butt is the ischium. And where your pubic hair would be is the pubis. Now, some schools have things like a homecoming or prom, and during a event like homecoming or prom, you might be going out with your date, and in that case, they're going to take their phalanges, and they might put their phalanges on the cervical vertebrae, all right? The guy's going to put his hands here on the ilium, if they're dancing together, like that, ilium. And we're going to make some eye contact, ilium. All right, what you don't want is a hand to go to the ischium, all right? That will be bad, all right? So keep your hands on the ilium, not the ischium, all right? That will be bad. All right, now let's look at the leg bones. We'll incorporate the leg bones. The longest and strongest bone is the femur. So that's this, the longest and strongest bone. Your kneecap is the patella, so we're going to pat your patella. In the lower leg, we've got 2 bones, just like in the lower arm. We've got the tibia. This is the true weight-bearing bone. So the true weight-bearing bone is the tibia. The one beside it is the fibula, it's fibbing you. So this bone is not actually bearing any weight. Now don't go throwing it away. You still need it for muscle attachments and things, but it's not bearing any weight. It's fibbing you. So the fibula. All right, so the tibia, the fibula. Now instead of having carpals in your foot, you have tarsals. So think of North Carolina Tar Heels or the tar soles. So think about like stepping in tar with your tarsals. So these are the tarsals. This is a major tarsal, the calcaneus. So think of, it's your heel bone. So think of calluses on your calcaneus.
To remember the tarsals, think tall centers never take shots from corners. Talus, calcaneus, navicular. And then 3rd, 2nd, 1st, cuneiform. And then for corners, it's cuboid. And that might help you remember the tarsals.
So stepping in tar with your tarsals, then these are the metatarsals. Meta means beyond. So these are the metatarsals, and then these are the phalanges. Very similarly, metatarsal 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and phalanges are still proximal and distal, proximal, intermediate or middle, and distal for the phalanges, for each of those toe bones. So let's add these in to our sequence. We'll start again, say hi to the hyoid, cervical, thoracic, lumbar. You sit on the sacrum, coccyx is the shock absorber. Commonly broken bone is clavicle, flat like a spatula, scapula. A stern person pokes you in the sternum. These ribs are true. These ribs are false. These ribs are floating. This is the not so funny humerus, rotating radius. The pinky side is the ulna. You drive a car with your carpals, make a fist with your metacarpals. Your fingers are phalanges. Here in the pelvic girdle is the ilium. the bony butt is the ischium, where your pubic hair would be, is the pubis. Your femur bone is the longest and strongest bone. Your patella, your patella, that's your kneecap. Your tibia, that's the true one. The fibula, that's the one beside it. The calcaneus is one of your tarsals, like you're stepping in tar with your tarsals. Metatarsals, phalanges for your toes. What I'm going to do then is just add a few of the most prominent processes. Processes are parts of bones that just stick way out. So for example, right here is the mastoid process sticking out of the temporal bones. That's the mastoid process right there. Down here on the sternum is the xiphoid process sticking way out down here into the abdomen, the xiphoid process. This is the acromion process sticking out way up here in the shoulder. And then down here, like a crow's beak, is the coracoid process. Here, coracoid. And then here on your elbow, that's your olecranon process, These two here, the top two cervical vertebrae, they are significant because one is called the atlas, the other is called the atlas. And the atlas is like the Greek god holding up the world. So that's this C1 is the atlas, it's holding up the head. All right, so atlas, that's C1, it's got a special name because it's holding up the head. The axis has this process that sticks up. So even though it's the lower bone, it's got this part that's sticking up, and the atlas kind of sits over top of it. So the part that's sticking up here, this little process, is kind of what allows you to rotate your head. So it has this little point sticking up. So I remember it like this. The atlas and the axis hold up the mastoid. So atlas and axis hold up the mastoid. Acrobat, acromion, flies over the coracoid. And I remember like acrobat because it's attached to the trapezius muscle. So I think of like the acromion is this acrobat on the flying trapezius muscle, this big muscle here that makes up your shoulder here. So atlas and axis hold up the mastoid. Acromion flies over, like acrobat acromion flies over the coracoid. And then I think old cranon, like an old crayon, like you're mashing up old crayons with the elbow. So I think of old cranon in the elbow and avoid the xiphoid. Like whenever you're doing the Heimlich maneuver, avoid the xiphoid. So that'll be a few of the major processes. So right there are the bones of the body. Hopefully that helps you remember them.